Hi, mystery readers. I'm Alexandra Amor. This is It's a Mystery Podcast, and I'm here today with Mary Castillo. Hi, Mary.
Hi, how are
Very
you?
well. How are you?
Doing good. I'm in Southern California and we're getting a heat wave for Thanksgiving.
Oh,
So I was really excited. I had my scarves out. Now I got to pull out the summer stuff.
once again. Well, that's a nice problem to have.
It is.
Yes. So let me introduce our listeners to you. Amazon mystery best-selling author Mary Castillo loves a great startle, even though she makes her husband get up with her in the middle of the night after watching a scary movie. When she's not gardening, hiking, or knitting, she's engrossed in a book. She writes books she loves, chilling paranormal mysteries mixed with heartwarming romance and compelling characters who keep you turning the pages long past your bedtime. Mary grew up in a haunted house in National City, California, that inspired the Dori O paranormal mystery series, which is what we're going to talk about here today. So, first of all, Mary, why don't you just give us a little overview of the series itself?
The Dori O Paranormal Mystery Series started as a novella. It was a chick lit novella back in 2005 through 2005 to 2008. I wrote romantic comedies, chick lit, and I put together a anthology called Names I Call My Sister. And I started this story about this family wedding gone awry. And Dory and her Grammy and her sister were the central characters in the story. And so afterwards, Dory stayed in my mind. She's a robbery detective with San Diego PD. She comes from she's the white sheep in a family of black sheep, and so her felonious grandparents were just these wild people, and she is a cop, and she just never really let me go after I finished her story. So in must have been about 2008 when I published my last chick lit. I wanted to write her story, and originally it was going to be a paranormal chick lit. It was going to be more of a lighter comedy. And at the time, that was the time of the recession. A lot of us authors were unfortunately let go by our publishers, and I was suddenly had the freedom to do whatever I wanted. And I decided to finally write the book I was so afraid to write. I didn't think I had the chops for it. I wanted to write like a gothic Victoria Holt, Mary Stuart, Daphne du Maurier type of book, because those were the books that I read from middle school on. They were my guilty pleasures. And so Lost in the Light evolved from this moment of just having complete creative freedom, and then also putting her in a paranormal world. So Lost in the Light is the first book, the first official book in the series. And she has been involved in an officer shooting. She was shot and injured on the job on leave, and suddenly she can see and speak to ghosts. So we're now on the third. Yeah, my thing with her is she does not like the word psychic,
Oh,
even though she is one.
okay. Well, that's great because that was one of my questions. I wanted to ask if she had always had her abilities to communicate with ghosts, but they've come about because of this injury that she sustained on the job.
Yeah, I think that to an extent we're all very intuitive. Some of us can do more than others. So she was always an intuitive person, and but yeah, I think sometimes I use the excuse of having a traumatic injury, that it awoke this ability in her, and that's something that she grapples with because as the series has continued, she in the new book, Lost in Whispers, she has a not quite husband, fiance, and his 8-year-old daughter. And so she is juggling career and family and dealing with ghosts. And she actually, her boyfriend comes to the realization maybe you came back for a reason, and it's to help people who have not crossed over. So it's been an interesting dilemma to give to somebody who is very practical, very unwoo-woo, to talk to dead people like I'm talking to you.
Right, right. And it must have been, I mean, in the first book, Lost in the Light, it must have been a bit of a shock to her to have this happen. So tell us a little bit about the story. You don't have to spoil anything, but she moves into a house, correct? She's on leave.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, mhm. Yeah, she a lot of the book came from my real life. I'm not a cop, I'm not a psychic. But I did grow up in a haunted house, and the house that she has purchased, her dream home, is based on a real home in my hometown of National City. So I got to live in this home vicariously through her book. So yes, it is shocking. She thinks she's going crazy because she is dealing with PTSD.
Mm.
And one of my parents' friends they went to high school with him. He was a National City PD officer. So he gave me a lot of insight into the PTSD and some of the issues that he has dealt with. He's now retired. And he was very frank. He says, "Oh, very few cops are ever going to tell you that this is something we all deal with." And the aspect of her being shot on the job, that came from a story that I did when I was with the LA Times. I wrote for their community newspaper, the Laguna Beach coastline. And while I was a reporter, there was an officer involved shooting. And one of the officers, he was a young guy, had a situation where he was, he was shot, he was injured. And because I was on the inside, I knew a lot of the detectives and the police officers in the department. They talked about how he questioned whether he wanted to come back.
Mm.
So that gave me just a lot of rich emotional material to work with. And so I take it as a form of flattery. There have been a few police officers. Oh my gosh, sorry about that. That's my alarm that I have to stop writing.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
that's okay.
That's when you stop writing, get back to work.
Yeah.
So some police officers have actually, some said, "Oh, that's a bunch of baloney," and I'm like, "Yeah, it's fiction. I mean, if I wanted to write real life, it'd be a training manual, and nobody would read it." Others have said, "Yeah, actually, some of that stuff, has rang true for them." So I take that as, that's the highest form of flattery that an author can get.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so she's grappling with this new sort of skill that's come to her, and is dealing with a ghost in this house that she's moved into, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the thing that I thought was really interesting is that the mystery that she's going to be working on with the ghost isn't in the present, even though she is. The mystery is actually in the Prohibition era. So tell us a little bit about what drew you to that era.
Well, I've always loved the 1920s. My mom's mother was a flapper. My mom's mother was a much older mom. She was almost 50 when she had my mom. So she lived quite the life. And I was always fascinated by that period. I loved the movies, The Untouchables, and loved James Cagney movies, Humphrey Bogart movies. I grew up watching a lot of black and white movies. So I wanted to write about that period. And the first draft of that book, he did not play Vicente, the bootlegger in her house, did not play a big role. He was kind of like one of those ghosts who she kind of sees out of the corner of her eye, and it was really boring. The book came alive when I started writing from his point of view. And I was also a little frustrated because I grew up in San Diego. I grew up in National City where the book takes place. And we're right on the border between Mexico. And there was a lot of, it was like the Wild West during Prohibition. And so when you think of Prohibition, it's always told from the point of view of Chicago, New York, the Italian gangsters. Well, believe me, there was plenty going on down here in Southern California because of the convenience of having Mexico, and in a lot of ways, the bootleggers were the pioneers, you might say, of some of the activity that happens even today. So I researched a lot of LA Times articles and found a kingpin like Vicente's boss And really quickly, what was once the book came out, I got a Facebook message from the real kingpin, from his, I believe she was like a great great niece, and she was so excited because she says, I thought that sounded really familiar, that, to my great 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 uncle. And what else do you know about him? And I was like, well, I made up the rest. I don't know if he killed anybody. I mean, it's like, don't sue me, please. But she was actually very excited because they were doing some research, and it was like he was like the dark secret of the family. But I found his intake record in prison, and that was that was kind of fun. You don't always get that.
No, that's incredible. Yeah. Yeah. What an amazing connection through time, across time, sort of. And yeah, just incredible. I think that's amazing. Good for you. Mm-hmm. And so in the second book, Lost in Whispers, which just came out, we should say, by the time this podcast comes out, the book will have been out about a month. And it's set in a different era. So tell us a little bit about the historical part of that one as well.
Yeah, so Lost in Whispers is the second novel. It's actually the third book. There's a novella. It's only in ebook form called Girl in the Mist. And that's more of a it's about Dori and Gavin. I don't want to give anything away. And so Lost in Whispers takes place in the present day, and it also takes place in 1940. I always mess this up. 1942. I always want to say 1943. It's right after Pearl Harbor, and it is about a U.S. Navy nurse who has been dishonorably discharged because she is expecting a child out of wedlock, and she survived Pearl Harbor and has come to San Diego to finish out her pregnancy in a maternity home. And I'd always been fascinated by the idea. They used to call them baby farms because it was a very practical solution back in the day when a young woman found herself in the family way, would be sent to her aunt's house far, far away, usually to a maternity home, to wait out her pregnancy and give up her child for adoption. So it was for some people, they felt that was a great idea, but for a lot of these women, they suffered for the rest of their lives. They had this emptiness inside them. And this Lost in Whispers took me a long time to write because originally it was going to take place during Comic-Con, and it just didn't work. It didn't have the sparkle that Lost in the Light had. So we were at Pearl Harbor. We were at Oahu with friends of ours. My son is a huge history buff. And we go into the museum there before you go on to the USS Arizona Memorial, and there's this huge picture of a Army nurse who served during Pearl Harbor. And it was like all the lights go off, and it's like, yes, this is who I need to write about. And it turns out she had her memoir. They sold it in the gift shop. And that's what started the whole thing. So I put Rosalind right in the middle of the action. We do flashback and see her experience at Pearl Harbor because it results in her having a baby. And so the more I wrote about her, the more that she just revealed to me. I do a lot of character work ahead of time, but they always somehow take a life of their own. And that's when I know it's working. Well, I wouldn't say that, but I would say this. So that's why I picked that period. And then it turns out, I don't always plan these things, but, Dori is dealing with motherhood, becoming a surrogate mother to Gavin's little child. And I mean, it just was like, hey, that's pretty cool. I could take credit and say like, yeah, I thought all of this out ahead of time, but I didn't. It just happened on its own.
Oh, that's amazing. And so when you had originally thought that you would set the book at Comic-Con, was there no historical element to it at that point?
Well, it if I look at my own history, I remember going to some of the original Comic-Cons, and so that was about 30 years ago. So yes, for us Gen Xers, that was back in the day, when it was like some fold-up tables at the main hall of the convention center and a bunch of nerds. I remember my friends were so big on this guy who wrote this lame Sandman comic, and I was like, yeah, like this is boring. It's not Wonder Woman. I tried to get into it, and I met Neil Gaiman. I didn't know who he was. I was like, yeah, I'm here because I just wanted to hang out with my friends, and Now it's my husband went a few years ago, and he was just like, it was like, he's like, I don't know how to describe it. It was, 2 hours to wait for the men's room. So I was like, I remember
Oh,
nobody was there. So anyway, it actually was based on a case that my technical advisor had told me about. It was his case where this young woman she was a missing person for a long time, and he later discovered that he actually worked with a guy who murdered her and buried her body somewhere out in Julian. Um, and so I don't know, it wouldn't come together, and so it's always that story's in my back pocket, but I mean now I've given it away. So I
right.
mean, where's the surprise in that? But it may. I'm sure it will come. It'll come to life. It'll find life somehow.
Yes. Oh, they always do. Yes. And so
Hmm.
you used the word juggling earlier in the interview, and I wanted to specifically ask you how you balance, maybe that's a better word, the different
Hmm.
elements in the books. So there's a bit of romance, there's the paranormal stuff, there's a mystery
Hmm.
going on, you're dealing with the present day and with history. So tell us a little bit
Hmm.
about how you weave all that stuff together.
Well, I wrote a couple of drafts of the book, so I just threw it all out there. This book has been through I don't know how many drafts. I've lost count. And then it came to the point where I realized I have a lot going on here. I need to know who, what, when, where. And so I take index cards, and I use colored pencils, and I went through and took all the major plot points. I come from not a professional screenwriting program background, but I was originally wanted to be a screenwriter. So I took a lot of screenwriting classes when I was at USC, and that's how I use that 3 act structure to plot out my books. So I was able to, I knew, when the end of the first act is, and what the middle point of the second act, and I mapped it all out. I had like I don't know, like 50 cards at one point, and
Yeah.
then I was able to move them around so I could then see how, instead of it just being like some huge mess, they would interweave together and support one another, and that was the majority of the work right there, then and there. I've learned a lot from writing this book, and so as I'm approaching the novella, which will be a shorter form, it'll maybe be 40,000 words. Um, I have to remember like who is who and who's dating who and who's not dating who. Efficient in planning out these books and planning out the series too, because at this point I realized I really should have an idea of where I'm going. So yeah, I learned a lot of what not to do while writing Lost in Whispers.
Oh, okay, yeah. And so it sounds like you don't use software for your writing, like Scrivener or
Mm.
no. Okay, got it.
No, I would probably get way into playing with the software than writing. So
Ah,
I just stick with Microsoft Word.
okay, yeah.
It works.
And was there anything about the Prohibition era or even the Pearl Harbor incident that you learned that surprised you when you were doing the research for these books?
Yeah, I was a history major when I was in college. Always loved history, and I love those untold histories. So the stories of the maternity homes, for one.
Mm.
I always I write from curiosity, really. I'm kind of a nosy person. I'm the kind of person who, if I'm at lunch with you, I start listening to the people at the table next to us because they're breaking up. Um, and so research and grandparents, our greatest generation grandparents, like to tell us, and it's like, oh yeah, you did. They just like anybody. And there was about this hiking trail that they would go to on the land, and he just openly admitted to the author that he's like, oh yeah, you knew everybody was what they were doing up there because of all the condoms that you'd find on the trail. And I thought, oh, well, that's not something I expected to read from like an 80-year-old man. But yeah, I think that in all my years of being a history major and studying history, people have not changed, and nobody was more virtuous than anyone else. We all love the same vices, so to speak. So that has always kind of tickled my sense of humor. And then with Prohibition, um, I think what surprised me the most, and I didn't think about it until I started writing about it, is how you could go from being this poor, nothing of a person, not even have an education, and be suddenly just have just gobs of money.
Mm.
And because that's what happens to Vicente. And so I, I didn't even dawn on me till I started reading that, and I thought, oh yeah, no wonder these guys had, were just such a mess, and because they, like modern drug dealers, were like, oh, I have millions of dollars at my disposal, I'll just drown it in champagne. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
So those were, I think, those very human details and elements surprised me, that caught me a little off guard as I was doing my research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, so we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to ask you one final question about whether or not you're working on another story, another Dori O paranormal mystery.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm working on a novella.
Okay.
And I think I know what it's about. The thing I left myself with Lost in Whispers are so many, how should I say, unanswered questions. So it was one of those things. I was like, I just got to finish this thing, and so I've left myself with an embarrassment of riches, so to speak. But it's basically going to take us right after the end of Lost, with the emotional fallout of what I did to my poor characters in this book. So I'm also planning a spin-off series that will be a paranormal romantic series. And then I also want to see what happens with Meg and Richard, who, in Lost in Whispers are kind of dealing with some stuff. And I also, actually, Rosalind is still in my head, and I wonder maybe there might be some more stories involving her, but I just need the time to write them. So, I have a lot of stories to write and not a lot of time to do it. So I got to be disciplined and just get to work.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And why a novella next rather than a full-length novel?
I just need the rest. This book took about 4 years to write. The first draft, which I totally tossed out. Actually, I didn't toss that out, but I only tossed out 75% of it. Dori, her contemporary story, has pretty much stayed the same, but the historical part of it just didn't work. So yeah, it took a long time, and so I feel like I'm gonna just get my toes wet, and work with a novella. Also to satisfy the practical concern of producing work that my fans want in a timely manner, and just just take it easy on myself.
Yes.
It's kind of a selfish thing.
No, I hear you, and it's good to satisfy the fans and give them something more, sooner than every 4 years.
Sure. Yeah.
So this has been amazing, Mary. Why don't you let our listeners know where they can find out more about your books?
Well, you can come to my website at marycastillo.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and BookBub and Goodreads if you prefer to follow your authors on those forums. And if you do join my newsletter, I send out a free sampler of all the first chapters from the Dori book. So if you've never heard of these or you're catching up, it's just a great way to get introduced to the series. And get sucked into this world.
Right, exactly. Well, that's awesome. And your books can be found on Amazon as well, is that right?
Yes, they're on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and iTunes.
All the usual.
So they're all the usual suspects.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.